What if the person you've been judging for months turned out to be your greatest inspiration? What if the excuse you mocked became the reason you found your purpose? Sometimes life has a way of teaching us lessons through the people we least expect. This is a story about assumptions, hidden strength, and how one moment of revelation can change everything we think we know about courage. Sarah Martinez had been attending Westfield Community College for 2 years, but she was the girl everyone noticed for all the wrong reasons. Always sitting in the back corner of the classroom, always leaving early from group activities, always having an excuse ready when physical education class came around. To her classmates, especially to Jake Thompson, the star athlete of their batch, Sarah was just another student trying to avoid effort. But on one ordinary Tuesday afternoon, when frustration boiled over and cruel words were spoken, Sarah would do something that would leave everyone speechless. She would take off her jacket and reveal a truth so powerful that it would transform not just how others saw her, but how they saw themselves. This is the story of how mockery turned to admiration, how judgment became understanding, and how one brave young woman taught an entire classroom that strength comes in forms we never expect to find. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of Westfield Community College's main building, casting long shadows across the polished floors. Students hurried through the corridors with their backpacks and coffee cups, chattering about weekend plans and upcoming exams. Among them walked Sarah Martinez, her steps measured and careful, her oversized navy jacket wrapped tightly around her small frame despite the warm September weather. Sarah had perfected the art of being invisible. She knew exactly which routes to take to avoid the busiest hallways, which seats in each classroom offered the best view of the exit, and how to time her movements so she rarely had to navigate through crowds. It wasn't that she was antisocial by nature, but 2 years of college had taught her that drawing attention to herself only led to questions she wasn't ready to answer. Her first class of the day was Introduction to Psychology with Professor Williams, a kind woman in her 50s who had a talent for making even the most complex theories seem approachable. Sarah slipped into her usual seat in the back left corner, close enough to the door that she could leave quickly when needed, but far enough back that she rarely caught the professor's eye during discussions. As she settled into her seat and pulled out her notebook, she couldn't help but notice the animated conversation happening 3 rows ahead of her. Jake Thompson, the college's golden boy, was regaling his friends with stories from the previous weekend's basketball tournament. His voice carried easily across the classroom, filled with the confidence that came naturally to someone who had never known failure or struggle. Jake was everything Sarah wasn't. Tall and athletic, with an easy smile and the kind of natural charisma that made professors remember his name and classmates gravitate toward him. He was the president of the Student Athletic Association, captain of the basketball team, and, according to campus gossip, had already been offered partial scholarships to transfer to several 4-year universities. So there I was, down by 2 points with 30 seconds left, Jake was saying, his hands gesturing dramatically as he recreated the final moments of Saturday's game. Coach calls a timeout, and I tell the team, give me the ball, and I'll take us home. And that's exactly what happened. His friends laughed and clapped him on the back, and Sarah found herself rolling her eyes slightly. She had heard variations of this story before. Jake's heroic moments seemed to multiply with each telling, and his confidence bordered on arrogance. But she had to admit, begrudgingly, that his success wasn't entirely unearned. She had seen him play during the campus tournaments, and his skill was undeniable. Professor Williams entered the classroom, her arms full of papers and her characteristic warm smile already in place. Good morning, everyone. I hope you're all ready to dive into some fascinating material today. We're going to be discussing resilience and the human capacity to overcome adversity. Sarah straightened in her seat. This was a topic that resonated with her more deeply than any of her classmates could imagine. She opened her notebook and prepared to take detailed notes, grateful for a subject that felt personally relevant rather than purely academic. Resilience, Professor Williams began, writing the word in neat letters across the whiteboard, isn't just about bouncing back from difficult situations. It's about the ability to adapt, to find strength in unexpected places, and to continue moving forward even when the path seems impossible. As the professor spoke, Sarah found herself thinking about her own journey to this classroom. The obstacles she had overcome just to be here, sitting among students who took their education for granted. The daily challenges that none of them could see, hidden beneath her carefully maintained facade of normalcy. Can anyone give me an example of resilience they've observed or experienced? Professor Williams asked, scanning the room with encouraging eyes. Several hands shot up immediately. Jake's voice rose above the others as he spoke without waiting to be called on. Last year, when I tore my ACL during the championship game, the doctor said I might not play again. But I did 6 months of intensive physical therapy, worked out twice a day, and came back stronger than ever. That's resilience. The class murmured appreciatively, and Professor Williams nodded. That's a great example of physical resilience and determination, Jake. The ability to recover from injury and return to peak performance requires tremendous dedication. Sarah found herself gripping her pen more tightly. While Jake's recovery was certainly admirable, something about the way he presented it bothered her. It seemed so straightforward in his telling, a simple matter of working hard and achieving results. But resilience, as Sarah understood it, was often much more complicated and much less visible than successful athletic comebacks. Anyone else have an example to share? Professor Williams continued. A girl named Emma raised her hand. My mom went back to school when she was 45 after my dad left. She worked full-time during the day and took classes at night for 3 years to get her nursing degree. She said it was the hardest thing she'd ever done, but now she has a career she loves, and we're financially stable. Excellent example, Emma. That illustrates resilience in the face of major life changes and the courage to start over when circumstances force us to adapt. Sarah wanted to contribute to the discussion, but she hesitated. Her own examples of resilience were too personal, too revealing. She couldn't talk about the months of surgeries, the years of recovery, the ongoing challenges that required constant adaptation. Those experiences had taught her more about true resilience than any textbook could, but they weren't stories she could share in a casual classroom discussion. The conversation continued around her, with students offering examples ranging from overcoming test anxiety to dealing with the stress of choosing a major. Sarah listened and took notes, but part of her mind wandered to the next class on her schedule, the one she dreaded most. Physical education was a graduation requirement that couldn't be avoided, though Sarah had managed to defer it for as long as possible. Dr. Peterson, the PE instructor, was a former military man who believed that physical fitness was the foundation of mental discipline. He was fair but demanding, and he had little patience for what he perceived as excuses or lack of effort. Sarah had developed a careful strategy for managing PE class. She participated when she could, modified activities when necessary, and had a doctor's note that allowed her to sit out certain exercises. But she could feel the judgment from her classmates, particularly from students like Jake who saw physical challenges as obstacles to be overcome through sheer willpower and determination. As psychology class drew to a close, Professor Williams assigned them to write a short essay about a time they had witnessed or experienced resilience in their own lives. Sarah felt a familiar mix of frustration and sadness. She had more material for that essay than probably anyone in the class, but most of it was too private to share. The bell rang, and students began gathering their belongings. Sarah waited until most of the class had filed out before standing and making her way toward the door. She had learned to time her exits carefully to avoid the crush of students in the hallways, but also to minimize the chance of awkward conversations or unwanted attention. Sarah, could you stay for just a moment? Professor Williams called out as she passed the desk. Sarah's heart sank slightly. She had hoped to make it through the class without being noticed, but Professor Williams had always been more observant than most. I wanted to talk to you about the essay assignment, the professor said kindly once the classroom had emptied. I know you don't participate much in class discussions, but your written work has been exceptional. You have insights into human behavior and psychology that go beyond what I typically see from students your age. Thank you, Sarah said quietly, adjusting her backpack on her shoulders. I'm assigning this essay because I believe everyone has stories of resilience worth sharing, even if they don't recognize it themselves. Sometimes the most powerful examples come from people who don't see their own strength clearly. Professor Williams paused, studying Sarah's face carefully. I hope you'll consider sharing something meaningful in your essay. You might be surprised by how your experiences could inspire others. Sarah nodded, unsure how to respond. Professor Williams's words were kind, but they also felt like a gentle challenge. I'll think about it, she said finally. That's all I ask. Have a good rest of your day, Sarah. As Sarah left the classroom and headed toward her next class, she found herself thinking about what Professor Williams had said. The professor seemed to sense that there was more to Sarah's story than what appeared on the surface, but Sarah wasn't sure she was ready to let anyone see beneath the carefully constructed barriers she had built around herself. The hallways were crowded now, and Sarah moved carefully through the streams of students. She could see Jake up ahead, surrounded by his usual group of friends as they headed toward the gymnasium. Their laughter carried over the noise of conversations and slamming lockers, and Sarah felt a familiar pang of something she couldn't quite name. It wasn't exactly envy, because she didn't want Jake's life or his attention. But there was something about his easy confidence, his assumption that the world would accommodate his needs and celebrate his successes, that highlighted everything she felt she couldn't be. The gymnasium loomed ahead, its double doors already propped open to release some of the heat that built up during the morning classes. Sarah could hear the bounce of basketballs and the squeak of sneakers on polished floors, sounds that reminded her of everything she loved about sports and everything she had lost. She paused outside the doors, taking a deep breath and pulling her jacket closer around her shoulders. In a few minutes, she would have to face another PE class, another opportunity for her classmates to wonder why she couldn't keep up, why she always had limitations, why she didn't just try harder like everyone else. But as she stood there, Professor Williams's words echoed in her mind. Stories of resilience worth sharing. Sometimes the most powerful examples come from people who don't see their own strength clearly. Sarah straightened her shoulders slightly and walked through the gymnasium doors. She might not be ready to share her story, but she was ready to face another day of being misunderstood. And perhaps, someday, that would be enough. The gymnasium at Westfield Community College was a cathedral of athletic achievement, its walls lined with banners celebrating decades of championship teams and record-breaking performances. Trophy cases gleamed under the fluorescent lights, filled with evidence of countless hours of training, dedication, and triumph. For most students, it was an inspiring environment that motivated them to push their physical limits and strive for excellence. For Sarah Martinez, it felt like walking into a museum of everything she could no longer be. Dr. Peterson stood at the center of the polished basketball court, his posture military straight, and his whistle hanging prominently around his neck. At 53, he still maintained the physique of the Marine he had once been, and his approach to physical education reflected his belief that discipline and effort could overcome any obstacle. "All right, everyone, gather around," he called out in his characteristic commanding voice. "Today we're going to focus on circuit training. I've set up 8 stations around the gym, each designed to challenge different muscle groups and aspects of fitness." Sarah joined the loose circle of 22 students, positioning herself slightly behind the others where she could observe without being the focus of attention. She had learned to read Dr. Peterson's moods and energy levels, and today she sensed that he was feeling particularly motivated to push the class hard. The circuit includes pull-ups, push-ups, burpees, jumping jacks, planks, mountain climbers, squat jumps, and sprint intervals, Dr. Peterson continued, pointing to each station as he spoke. "You'll spend 2 minutes at each station, with 30 seconds of rest between transitions. The goal is to maintain maximum effort throughout the entire circuit." Sarah felt her stomach tighten as she mentally went through the list of exercises. Several of them would be impossible for her to complete in their traditional form, and others would require careful modification to avoid injury or strain. She had learned to improvise over the years, finding ways to participate while working within her limitations, but it always required a delicate balance of pushing herself without causing damage. "Martinez," Dr. Peterson called out, and Sarah's attention snapped back to the present. "I know you have some restrictions, but I want to see you really challenge yourself today. No sitting out unless absolutely necessary." "Yes, sir," Sarah replied quietly, aware that several of her classmates had turned to look at her. She could feel Jake's eyes on her particularly, his expression carrying the familiar mix of curiosity and mild irritation that she had come to associate with his opinion of her. The class began to spread out toward the various stations, and Sarah found herself gravitating toward the pull-up station, partly because it was in a corner where she would be less visible to the rest of the class. She knew she wouldn't be able to complete a traditional pull-up, but she had developed a modified version using resistance bands that Dr. Peterson had grudgingly approved. Jake was at the station next to her, preparing for what appeared to be an ambitious set of burpees. As he stretched and adjusted his athletic shoes, Sarah could hear him talking to his friend Marcus about their plans for the upcoming basketball season. "Coach thinks we have a real shot at the regional championship this year," Jake was saying, his voice carrying the easy confidence that seemed to permeate everything he did. My shoulder's completely healed from last year's injury, and I've been putting on muscle all summer. I'm in the best shape of my life. Marcus nodded enthusiastically. Man, you're like a machine. I don't know how you do it. Even when you got hurt, you just powered through and came back stronger. Sarah began her modified pull-up routine, using the resistance bands to assist her movement while still engaging her upper body muscles. She had learned to make these modifications look as close to the original exercise as possible, partly to avoid drawing attention and partly to maintain some sense of normalcy in an environment where her limitations were constantly highlighted. That's the thing about athletics, Jake continued, clearly warming to his favorite topic. It's all mental. When you really want something, you find a way to make it happen. Pain is temporary, but giving up lasts forever. As he spoke, Jake launched into his burpees with explosive energy, each movement crisp and powerful. Sarah couldn't help but admire his athletic ability, even as his words stung in ways he couldn't possibly understand. The assumption that effort alone determined outcomes, that wanting something badly enough guaranteed success, revealed a worldview shaped by privilege and circumstance that he didn't even recognize. The whistle blew, signaling the first transition. Sarah moved to the push-up station, where she dropped to her knees to perform modified push-ups. She had learned that this version allowed her to maintain proper form while accommodating her physical realities, but she was acutely aware that to observers, it might look like she was taking the easy way out. Dr. Peterson walked among the students, offering encouragement and corrections. When he reached Sarah, he paused for a moment, watching her form critically. Good modification, Martinez, but I want to see you push the pace a little more. You're being too cautious. Remember, we grow by stepping outside our comfort zones. Sarah nodded and increased her pace slightly, though she knew that what looked like caution to Dr. Peterson was actually carefully calibrated self-preservation. She had learned through painful experience exactly where her limits were, and pushing beyond them didn't lead to growth. It led to setbacks that could take weeks or months to recover from. At the station next to her, a girl named Ashley was struggling with her push-ups, her arms shaking with effort as she tried to maintain proper form. Jake, who had moved to the planking station, called out encouragement. Come on, Ashley. Mind over matter. You've got this. Ashley managed a few more repetitions before her arms gave out completely, and she collapsed onto the mat, breathing heavily. Jake flashed her an encouraging smile. See? You just needed to believe in yourself. That's what separates the winners from the quitters. Sarah felt a flash of irritation at Jake's oversimplified philosophy, but she kept her expression neutral and continued with her exercise routine. The whistle blew again, and she moved to the next station. As the circuit continued, Sarah found herself falling into a rhythm that balanced participation with self-care. She had become skilled at reading her body's signals, at knowing when to push and when to pull back. But she was also increasingly aware of the looks and whispered comments from her classmates. Why does she get to do everything differently? She heard someone mutter during one of the transition periods. I heard she has some kind of medical condition, but she looks fine to me, another voice responded. Sarah pretended not to hear, but the comments landed like small cuts, each one adding to a collection of wounds she carried everywhere. The assumption that she was either faking her limitations or simply not trying hard enough was a constant presence in her life, and PE class seemed to amplify those judgments. During the jumping jack station, Sarah modified the movement to remove the impact component, stepping her feet out and while raising her arms overhead. To someone watching casually, it might have looked like she wasn't putting in full effort, but Sarah knew that this modification allowed her to participate in the cardiovascular challenge while protecting her joints from damage. Jake, meanwhile, was attacking the exercise with characteristic intensity, his movements sharp and explosive. As he jumped, Sarah could see the competitive fire in his eyes, the drive that had made him successful in athletics, and probably in other areas of his life as well. When the whistle blew for the next transition, Jake wiped sweat from his forehead and glanced over at Sarah. His expression was unreadable, but Sarah had learned to recognize the subtle signs of judgment and dismissal that often preceded uncomfortable conversations. You know, Jake said, apparently unable to resist offering his perspective, I noticed you modify pretty much every exercise. Have you ever tried just going for it? Like, really pushing through the discomfort? Sarah felt her cheeks flush, partly from exertion and partly from embarrassment. This was the conversation she had been dreading, the moment when someone would finally voice what she knew many of her classmates were thinking. I modify what I need to modify. she replied quietly, hoping to end the conversation before it could develop into something more uncomfortable. But Jake seemed genuinely puzzled by her response, as if the concept of physical limitations that couldn't be overcome through willpower was foreign to his experience. I mean, I get that some exercises are harder than others, he continued, but isn't that the point? When I was recovering from my ACL injury, the physical therapy was brutal. But I knew that if I just pushed through the pain, I'd come out stronger on the other side. Marcus nodded in agreement. Jake's right. He was doing 2-a-day workouts while he was still in physical therapy. That's dedication. Sarah felt a familiar mixture of frustration and resignation. How could she explain that some limitations weren't temporary obstacles to be overcome, but permanent realities that required adaptation and acceptance? How could she make them understand that her modifications weren't about avoiding effort, but about finding ways to participate safely within her constraints? It's not the same thing, she said finally, her voice barely audible over the sounds of the gymnasium. Jake's expression shifted slightly, and Sarah could see that he was genuinely trying to understand her perspective, even if his worldview made it difficult for him to grasp concepts that fell outside his experience. What do you mean it's not the same thing? He asked, his tone more curious than confrontational. Sarah glanced around the gymnasium, aware that their conversation had attracted the attention of several nearby students. Dr. Peterson was on the other side of the court, demonstrating proper form for mountain climbers to a group of students who were struggling with the exercise. Some challenges can't be solved with more effort, Sarah said, choosing her words carefully. Some things require different strategies, different approaches. Jake looked genuinely confused by this statement, as if she had spoken in a foreign language. His entire life experience had taught him that effort and determination were the keys to overcoming obstacles, and Sarah's perspective challenged that fundamental belief. But that's just making excuses, he said, and Sarah could hear that he wasn't trying to be cruel, just expressing his honest opinion. I mean, everyone has limitations, but the whole point is to push past them. That's how we grow. The whistle blew again, saving Sarah from having to respond immediately. She moved to the mountain climber station, grateful for the opportunity to focus on the exercise rather than continuing a conversation that was only becoming more uncomfortable. But as she began the modified version of mountain climbers that she had developed, Sarah could feel Jake's eyes on her, and she knew that he was mentally cataloging every adaptation she made, every way in which her approach differed from what he considered normal effort. The final stations passed in a blur of modified movements and careful self-monitoring. Sarah had learned to pay constant attention to her body's signals, to the subtle indicators that warned her when she was approaching her limits. It was a skill that had taken years to develop, born from necessity rather than choice. When Dr. Peterson finally blew the whistle to signal the end of the circuit, Sarah felt the familiar mixture of relief and accomplishment that came with successfully navigating another PE class. She had participated to the best of her ability, maintained her fitness goals, and avoided injury or setbacks. But as the class gathered their belongings and prepared to head to the locker rooms, Sarah noticed that Jake was still watching her with that puzzled expression, as if she were a problem he couldn't quite solve. Good work today, everyone, Dr. Peterson called out. I saw some real effort and improvement. Remember, the only limitations we have are the ones we accept. His words, meant to be motivational, landed heavily on Sarah's ears. She had heard variations of this sentiment countless times, and while she understood the positive intention behind them, they also revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of the difference between chosen limitations and imposed ones. As she walked toward the women's locker room, Sarah could hear Jake and Marcus continuing their conversation about mental toughness and the importance of never giving up. Their voices carried easily across the gymnasium, filled with the certainty that came from never having to question whether their bodies would cooperate with their ambitions. Sarah slipped into the locker room and found a quiet corner where she could change clothes without attracting attention. She moved carefully, aware of the soreness that always followed even modified exercise, and grateful for the privacy that allowed her to tend to her body's needs without explanation or justification. But even in the relative safety of the locker room, she couldn't escape the echo of Jake's words. The only limitations we have are the ones we accept. If only it were that simple. If only wanting something badly enough, trying hard enough, believing in yourself enough, could overcome every obstacle life placed in your path. Sarah knew better. She had learned through experience that some limitations were real, permanent, and had to be worked around rather than through. But explaining that to someone like Jake, whose entire worldview was built on the belief that effort guaranteed results, seemed impossible. She finished changing and gathered her belongings, preparing to face the rest of her day. As she headed toward the exit, she passed the trophy cases that lined the hallway, their gleaming contents a testament to the power of athletic achievement and determination. For just a moment, Sarah allowed herself to remember what it had felt like to be the kind of person those trophies celebrated, to be someone whose limitations were temporary obstacles rather than permanent companions. But the memory was too painful to sustain, and she quickly pushed it aside, focusing instead on the immediate challenge of making it through the rest of her classes without drawing any more unwanted attention or uncomfortable questions. The autumn air carried the first hint of winter as Sarah made her way across the Westfield Community College campus 3 weeks later. The leaves on the oak trees that lined the main walkway had turned brilliant shades of gold and crimson, creating a canopy of color that might have lifted her spirits under different circumstances. But today, Sarah barely noticed the beauty around her. Her mind was occupied with the growing tension that had been building in her PE class, a situation that seemed to worsen with each passing session. The dynamic between her and Jake had shifted since their conversation during circuit training. What had started as casual curiosity on his part had evolved into something more pointed and persistent. Jake seemed genuinely puzzled by Sarah's approach to physical exercise, and his attempts to understand had taken on an increasingly evangelical tone, as if he had made it his personal mission to cure her of what he perceived as a lack of proper motivation. "You just need to push through the mental barriers," he had told her the previous week when she had opted out of a particularly high-impact plyometric exercise. "The body can do amazing things when the mind is willing." Sarah had learned to respond to these comments with noncommittal nods and quick redirections, but she could feel her patience wearing thin. More troubling was the way Jake's perspective seemed to be influencing other students in the class. What had once been curious glances had become more pointed stares, and she had overheard whispered conversations that questioned why she was allowed different standards than everyone else. As she approached the gymnasium, Sarah caught sight of her reflection in the glass doors. Her navy jacket hung loosely around her frame, a constant companion that provided both physical comfort and psychological armor. She had chosen the jacket carefully when she started college, selecting something that would allow her to blend into the background while providing the coverage she needed. But lately, even this reliable shield felt insufficient against the growing scrutiny. Inside the gymnasium, Dr. Peterson was setting up equipment for what appeared to be a more intensive workout than usual. Sarah recognized the signs, the extra mats, the timing equipment, the serious expression on the instructor's face that indicated he was planning to push the class particularly hard. "Today we're going to test everyone's fitness levels with some standardized assessments," Dr. Peterson announced as the class gathered around him. "These tests will help establish baseline measurements for your progress throughout the semester." Sarah's stomach dropped. Standardized fitness tests were always challenging because they left little room for the kind of modifications that allowed her to participate safely. The tests were designed around the assumption that all bodies functioned within a certain range of normal, and accommodations were often seen as compromises that undermined the validity of the assessment. "We'll be doing timed runs, maximum push-ups, pull-ups for those who are able, and flexibility measurements," Dr. Peterson continued. "I know some of you have limitations, but I want everyone to challenge themselves to perform at their highest possible level." As the class began to spread out toward the various testing stations, Sarah felt the familiar anxiety that accompanied situations where her differences would be most visible. During regular exercise sessions, she could blend in with modifications that weren't obvious to casual observers. But testing situations highlighted every adaptation she needed to make. Jake approached the pull-up station with visible enthusiasm, stretching his arms and rolling his shoulders in preparation. He had been talking for weeks about his goal of completing 20 consecutive pull-ups, and Sarah could see the competitive fire in his eyes as he prepared for his attempt. Sarah positioned herself at the push-up testing area, where she knew she would need to perform the modified version that she had been using all semester. Dr. Peterson had grudgingly approved the modification, but she was aware that the students around her would see her dropping to her knees as a sign that she wasn't willing to challenge herself properly. "All right, Martinez, let's see what you've got," Dr. Peterson said, stopwatch in hand. 2-minute maximum, modified form as we discussed. Sarah dropped into position and began her modified push-ups, focusing on maintaining proper form while working within her physical constraints. She had learned to block out external distractions during these moments, but today she found it harder than usual to ignore the presence of her classmates. At the pull-up bar, Jake was performing with impressive consistency, his movements controlled and powerful. Sarah could hear Marcus counting repetitions and offering encouragement, creating an atmosphere of celebration around Jake's performance that highlighted the contrast with her own quiet, careful approach to the test. 15. 16. Come on, Jake, you've got this. Marcus called out, his voice carrying across the gymnasium. Other students had begun to gather around Jake's station, drawn by the energy and excitement of watching someone achieve an impressive athletic performance. Sarah tried to maintain her focus on her own test, but she could feel the isolation of performing alone while most of the class watched Jake's triumph. When her 2 minutes were complete, Dr. Peterson recorded her score with a neutral expression. Good effort, Martinez. You showed consistency and maintained form throughout. His praise was genuine but restrained, and Sarah knew that her score, while respectable for her circumstances, would pale in comparison to the performances of students like Jake who didn't need to make accommodations. At the pull-up station, Jake completed his 20th repetition to enthusiastic cheers from the gathered students. He dropped from the bar with a satisfied grin, accepting congratulations and high fives from his classmates. The celebration was infectious, and even Dr. Peterson offered an approving nod toward Jake's achievement. Outstanding work, Thompson. That's the kind of performance that demonstrates real commitment to fitness. The contrast between the reception of Jake's performance and her own wasn't lost on Sarah. While she didn't expect or even want the same kind of attention, the difference highlighted the gap between what was considered impressive effort and what was seen as merely adequate accommodation. As the class moved through the remaining tests, Sarah continued to navigate the careful balance between participation and self-preservation. The timed run was particularly challenging, as she had to maintain a pace that kept her within sight of the other students while avoiding the kind of high-impact stress that could cause problems later. Jake, meanwhile, seemed to be having his best day ever. His running time was well above average, his flexibility measurements were impressive, and his overall performance painted a picture of someone who had truly embraced the principles of physical fitness that Dr. Peterson championed. During the brief rest period between tests, Jake approached Sarah with what appeared to be genuine concern in his expression. Hey, I noticed you seem to be struggling a bit with some of the tests, he said, his tone careful but direct. Have you considered working with a trainer or maybe trying some different approaches? I know a guy who specializes in helping people break through plateaus. Sarah felt her jaw tighten slightly. Jake's offer was probably well-intentioned, but it was based on the assumption that her performance was due to lack of proper training or technique rather than fundamental physical constraints. I appreciate the suggestion, she replied diplomatically, but I work with my doctors to develop appropriate exercise plans. Jake's expression shifted to one of confusion mixed with what might have been mild frustration. Doctors? I mean, unless you have some serious medical condition, most limitations are really just mental blocks. I've seen people accomplish amazing things when they commit to pushing past their comfort zones. Several nearby students had begun to listen to the conversation, and Sarah could feel the familiar heat of embarrassment rising in her cheeks. This was exactly the kind of attention she had spent 2 years trying to avoid. It's not about comfort zones, she said quietly, hoping to end the conversation before it could escalate further. But Jake seemed to interpret her quiet response as confirmation of his theory about mental barriers. His voice took on the tone of someone who had found the source of a problem and was eager to offer a solution. See, that's exactly what I'm talking about. You're already defeated before you even try. I used to think I had limitations too, but then I learned that the only real limits are the ones we impose on ourselves. Marcus, who had been listening to the exchange, nodded in agreement. Jake's right. When he hurt his knee last year, doctors said he might not play basketball again. But he refused to accept that limitation and worked until he was better than ever. Sarah felt her patience finally reaching its breaking point. The comparison between Jake's temporary sports injury and her permanent physical realities was not just inaccurate, it was insulting. But more than that, the conversation was happening in front of an audience of classmates who were already questioning her commitment and effort. Recovery from a sports injury isn't the same as adapting to permanent physical differences, she said, her voice slightly stronger than before. Jake's expression became even more confused, as if Sarah had spoken in a foreign language. Permanent differences? Come on, Sarah. Unless you're missing a limb or something major like that, Most physical challenges can be overcome with the right approach and enough determination. The gymnasium seemed to go quiet around them, though Sarah knew that was probably her imagination. But she could feel the weight of her classmates' attention, the sense that this conversation had reached a point where some kind of resolution was expected. "You have no idea what you're talking about," Sarah said, her voice still quiet but carrying an edge that hadn't been there before. Jake's confusion was genuine, but it was also tinged with what looked like frustration. His entire worldview was built on the belief that effort and determination could overcome any obstacle, and Sarah's perspective challenged that fundamental conviction. "Look, I'm just trying to help," he said, his tone becoming slightly defensive. "But if you're going to make excuses instead of trying to improve, that's your choice. Just don't expect people to respect limitations that are mostly in your head." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. After 2 years of carefully managing her public image, of finding ways to participate without revealing the full extent of her differences, of enduring countless small judgments and assumptions, Jake had finally voiced what she suspected many people thought. Dr. Peterson's whistle blew, signaling that the class should gather for final instructions, but Sarah barely heard it. The conversation with Jake had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, and she found herself standing at a crossroads where she had to choose between continuing to hide or finally revealing the truth that she had worked so hard to protect. "Final reminders about next week's cardiovascular endurance test," Dr. Peterson was saying, but his words seemed to come from a great distance. "I want everyone to prepare properly and bring their best effort." As the class began to disperse toward the locker rooms, Jake lingered near Sarah, his expression now a mixture of concern and lingering confusion. "Look, I didn't mean to upset you," he said, his tone softer than before. "I just think you're selling yourself short. You seem like you could accomplish a lot more if you stopped letting your excuses hold you back." Sarah stared at him for a long moment, feeling the weight of every assumption, every judgment, every casual dismissal she had endured since starting college. Jake's face showed genuine puzzlement, as if he couldn't understand why his well-intentioned advice wasn't being received with gratitude. Around them, other students were gathering their belongings and heading toward the exits, but several were still within earshot, waiting to see how this conversation would resolve. Sarah could feel their attention like a physical presence, and she realized that this moment had become about more than just her relationship with Jake. This had become about whether she would continue to hide her truth to avoid difficult conversations, or whether she would finally trust her classmates with the reality of who she was and what she had overcome to be standing in this gymnasium at all. The choice felt monumental, terrifying, and completely unavoidable. Sarah looked around the gymnasium one more time, taking in the trophy cases and banners that celebrated athletic achievement, the equipment that had been designed for bodies that worked in predictable ways, the faces of classmates who had never had to question whether their bodies would cooperate with their ambitions. Then, she looked back at Jake, with his genuine confusion and his unshakable belief that effort could overcome any obstacle, and she made a decision that would change everything. The silence in the gymnasium stretched for what felt like an eternity, though it could have been no more than a few seconds. Sarah stood frozen, her hands trembling slightly as she looked into Jake's genuinely confused face. Around them, the normal sounds of a PE class ending seemed muted, as if the entire space was holding its breath for what would come next. Dr. Peterson had moved to his office to record the test scores, leaving the students to clean up the equipment and gather their belongings. But instead of the usual chatter and movement, many of the class members had slowed their activities, sensing that something significant was happening in the conversation between Sarah and Jake. "You really want to know why I can't just push through and overcome my limitations?" Sarah asked, her voice still quiet, but carrying a new quality that made several nearby students turn to look at her directly. Jake nodded, his expression showing that he was finally beginning to understand that this conversation was more serious than he had initially realized. "Yeah, I do. I mean, I'm not trying to be a jerk here. I genuinely don't understand what's stopping you from reaching your potential." Sarah took a deep breath, feeling as if she was standing at the edge of a cliff she had spent 2 years avoiding. The protective shell she had built around herself felt suddenly fragile, but the weight of Jake's assumptions and the accumulated burden of months of misunderstanding had finally become too heavy to carry alone. "Okay," she said, her voice growing stronger. "You want to know about my limitations? You think they're all in my head. You believe that if I just tried harder, pushed through the discomfort, and stopped making excuses, I could perform like everyone else. Marcus had stopped putting away equipment and was now openly listening to the conversation. Ashley, who had struggled with the fitness tests herself, had paused near the exit. Even Dr. Peterson had emerged from his office, apparently drawn by the unusual tone of the discussion happening in his gymnasium. Well, yeah, Jake said, though his confidence seemed to be wavering slightly. I mean, that's how it works for everyone else. When I was injured, I didn't let it define my limitations. I worked through it. Sarah felt something shift inside her chest, a loosening of the tight control she had maintained over her emotions for so long. The comparison to Jake's temporary sports injury, offered with such casual confidence, finally pushed her past the point where diplomacy and self-protection mattered more than truth. You want to see my limitations? She asked, and, without waiting for an answer, she reached for the zipper of her navy jacket. The movement was deliberate and purposeful, but Sarah could feel her hands shaking as she slowly pulled the zipper down. She had imagined this moment countless times over the past 2 years, but, in her imagination, it had always been a choice made in privacy or with people she trusted completely. She had never envisioned revealing herself in a gymnasium full of classmates who barely knew her. But Jake's words had created a moment where hiding was no longer possible, where the gap between her reality and his assumptions had become too wide to bridge with careful explanations and diplomatic deflections. As the jacket fell open, Sarah could see Jake's expression begin to change. The casual confidence that had characterized his demeanor throughout their conversation was replaced by something that looked like confusion, then concern, then shock. Sarah's left arm ended just above where her elbow should have been, the result of a childhood cancer that had required extensive surgery and treatment. Her right arm, while intact, bore the visible scars from multiple surgeries and the placement of medical devices that had been necessary during her treatment and recovery. But it wasn't just the prosthetic that she had kept hidden beneath her jacket. Her torso showed the evidence of years of medical treatment, surgical scars that told the story of a battle fought and won, but at a cost that would mark her body permanently. The gymnasium had gone completely silent. Even the ambient sounds of ventilation systems and distant hallway conversations seemed to fade as everyone present processed what they were seeing. Sarah let the jacket slip from her shoulders entirely, standing in her PE uniform with all her medical history visible. The prosthetic arm that allowed her to participate in many activities wasn't the sleek, high-tech device that movies often portrayed, but a functional tool that bore the wear marks of daily use. This is why I modify exercises, Sarah said, her voice now clear and strong. This is why I can't just push through and do more pull-ups. This is why I work with doctors instead of personal trainers. This is why your advice about mental barriers and determination doesn't apply to my situation. Jake's face had gone pale, and he seemed to be struggling to find words. The easy confidence that had characterized all of his previous interactions with Sarah had evaporated completely, replaced by what looked like genuine horror at the implications of the conversation they had just had. Sarah, I had no idea, he stammered, his voice barely audible. I'm so sorry. I assumed. You assumed I was lazy, Sarah continued, feeling a strange sense of liberation and finally, voicing the truth she had carried alone for so long. You assumed I was making excuses, that I wasn't trying hard enough, that I needed motivation instead of accommodation. Dr. Peterson had moved closer to the group, his expression showing a mixture of concern for Sarah and what appeared to be growing understanding of dynamics in his class that he hadn't previously recognized. You assumed, Sarah continued, that because you couldn't see my limitations, they must not be real. You assumed that your experience of recovering from a temporary sports injury was the same as my experience of learning to live with permanent physical differences. Ashley was crying quietly near the gymnasium exit, her hand covering her mouth as she absorbed the reality of what Sarah had been carrying alone. Marcus looked stricken, clearly remembering all the conversations he had participated in about effort and determination and mental barriers. I lost my arm to cancer when I was 12 years old, Sarah said, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was sharing. I spent 3 years in and out of hospitals. I learned to walk again, to write again, to do basic tasks that everyone else takes for granted. I learned to use a prosthetic that sometimes works perfectly and sometimes reminds me of everything I've lost. Jake was now visibly upset, his hands clenched at his sides as he struggled to process the gap between his assumptions and Sarah's reality. Sarah, please, I'm so sorry. I didn't know. I would never have said those things if I had known. But that's exactly the problem, Sarah replied, feeling emotions she had suppressed for years finally finding their voice. You shouldn't need to know someone's medical history to respect their limitations. You shouldn't assume that invisible challenges don't exist. You shouldn't believe that effort alone determines outcomes. The gymnasium had become a classroom in ways that Dr. Peterson had never intended. The lesson being taught wasn't about physical fitness or athletic achievement, but about assumptions, privilege, and the danger of judging others based on limited information. I come to this class every day knowing that I'll be surrounded by people who can do things I'll never be able to do again, Sarah continued. I modify exercises not because I'm lazy or unmotivated, but because I've learned through painful experience exactly what my body can and cannot safely handle. Dr. Peterson cleared his throat gently, his voice careful when he spoke. Sarah, I want you to know that I've always supported your accommodations, but I'm realizing that I may not have created an environment where other students understood the importance of those accommodations. Sarah nodded, appreciating his acknowledgement while also recognizing that this moment was about more than just PE class policies. I've spent 2 years trying to fit in, trying to be normal, trying not to draw attention to my differences. But normal for me will always be different from normal for everyone else. She looked around the gymnasium, taking in the faces of classmates who were seeing her clearly for the first time. Some looked stricken with guilt, others showed admiration, and a few displayed what appeared to be a new understanding of challenges they had never considered. I can do modified push-ups for the same reason that Jake can do 20 pull-ups, Sarah said, her voice gaining strength as she continued. Because we each work with what we have. The difference is that his capabilities are celebrated while mine are questioned. Jake was struggling visibly with the implications of everything he had said over the past weeks. Sarah, how can I make this right? I feel terrible about everything I said. Sarah looked at him for a long moment, seeing past his athletic achievements to the person beneath who was grappling with having his worldview fundamentally challenged. You can start by understanding that not everyone's story fits into your narrative about effort and determination. You can recognize that some of us are already pushing beyond what should be possible just by being here. The conversation was interrupted by slow, deliberate clapping. Ashley had moved closer to the group, and despite the tears on her face, she was applauding. Soon, Marcus joined in, then Dr. Peterson, then other students who had been listening to Sarah's words. The applause wasn't the enthusiastic celebration that had greeted Jake's fitness achievements earlier in the class. Instead, it was respectful, almost reverent, acknowledging not just Sarah's physical courage in revealing her prosthetic, but her emotional courage in sharing her truth with people who had spent months misunderstanding her. Sarah felt overwhelmed by the response, having expected judgment or pity rather than this kind of recognition. She had revealed her most protected secret expecting to be diminished by it, but instead, she felt strangely more substantial, more present, more real than she had in years. I don't want anyone to feel sorry for me, Sarah said as the applause died down. I've built a good life with the body I have now, but I do want people to understand that challenges come in many forms, and not all of them are visible. Jake stepped closer, his expression showing genuine remorse mixed with what looked like admiration. Sarah, you're incredible. Not because you overcame cancer, but because you've been dealing with all this while I made assumptions about who you were. Sarah smiled slightly, the first genuine smile she had offered Jake in all their months of shared classes. Thank you. That means more than you probably realize. As students began to gather their belongings for real this time, preparing to leave a gymnasium that had become the site of unexpected education, Sarah felt the strange lightness that comes from no longer carrying a secret alone. She had revealed her truth in the most public way possible, and instead of the judgment and dismissal she had feared, she had found understanding, respect, and the beginning of authentic connections with classmates who now saw her as she actually was rather than as they had assumed her to be. The navy jacket lay forgotten on the gymnasium floor, no longer needed as armor against a world that had proven more accepting than Sarah had dared to hope. 3 months had passed since that transformative afternoon in the Westfield Community College gymnasium, and the campus seemed different to Sarah in ways both subtle and profound. The same oak trees lined the walkways, the same buildings housed the same classrooms, but Sarah's experience of moving through this familiar space had changed completely. She no longer wore the navy jacket as daily armor. Instead, she had discovered a wardrobe that accommodated her prosthetic while allowing her to feel confident and authentic. More importantly, She had learned that hiding her differences hadn't protected her from judgment. It had only delayed the moment when she would need to address misconceptions and assumptions. The changes weren't just personal. Dr. Peterson had used the incident in his gymnasium as a catalyst for broader conversations about inclusion, accommodation, and the difference between visible and invisible challenges. He had reached out to the college's Disability Services Office and implemented new protocols for discussing physical limitations with sensitivity and understanding. But perhaps the most surprising change had been in Jake Thompson, the star athlete whose confident assumptions about effort and determination had precipitated Sarah's moment of revelation. "Sarah, wait up." Jake's voice called across the quad as Sarah made her way toward the psychology building for her final class of the semester with Professor Williams. Sarah turned to see Jake jogging toward her, his athletic grace as evident as ever, but his expression carrying none of the casual confidence that had once characterized their interactions. Over the past 3 months, Jake had undergone what could only be described as a complete transformation in his understanding of human limitations and the complexity of individual challenges. "How did your presentation go?" Jake asked as he caught up with her, slightly out of breath from his jog across campus. Sarah smiled, still adjusting to the reality that Jake Thompson now actively sought out her company and opinion. "It went well, I think. Professor Williams seemed pleased with my research on adaptive resilience. That's the one about how people with disabilities develop different, but equally valuable strategies for overcoming challenges, right?" Jake asked, demonstrating the kind of careful attention to Sarah's academic work that would have been unimaginable 3 months earlier. "Exactly. I focused on the difference between resilience that aims to restore previous capabilities and resilience that involves accepting new realities while finding innovative ways to achieve goals." Jake nodded thoughtfully. "That makes so much sense. I've been thinking about that a lot lately, actually. The way I used to think about overcoming obstacles was so narrow." This admission would have shocked anyone who had known Jake before his encounter with Sarah's truth. The confident athlete who had once believed that effort and determination could overcome any limitation had evolved into someone who actively sought to understand perspectives and experiences different from his own. The transformation had begun immediately after Sarah's revelation in the gymnasium. Jake had spent that evening researching prosthetics, childhood cancer, and the long-term effects of extensive medical treatment. But, more importantly, he had begun questioning fundamental assumptions about success, limitation, and the factors that determine human potential. "I wanted to ask you something," Jake said as they walked together toward the psychology building. "You know how I've been working with the athletic department on their new inclusive fitness programs?" Sarah nodded. Jake's involvement in adaptive athletics had been one of the most unexpected developments of the semester. After learning about Sarah's experience, he had approached the athletic department with proposals for expanding their programs to better serve students with various physical challenges. "Well, they've approved funding for a new position, an adaptive fitness coordinator who would work with students who need accommodations or modified programs. And I was wondering." Jake paused, looking suddenly uncertain in a way that reminded Sarah of how far he had come from the confident athlete who had once dismissed her limitations. "You were wondering what?" Sarah prompted, curious about what had made Jake, of all people, look nervous. "I was wondering if you might consider applying for the position. I know you're planning to transfer to a 4-year university next fall, but the job could provide great experience, and, honestly, you're the most qualified person I can think of." Sarah stopped walking, genuinely surprised by the suggestion. "Jake, I appreciate the thought, but I don't have any formal training in fitness coordination or adaptive sports." "But you have something more valuable than formal training," Jake replied, his voice carrying genuine conviction. "You have lived experience with adaptation, accommodation, and finding ways to achieve fitness goals within physical constraints. You understand what it's like to be underestimated and misunderstood." As they resumed walking, Sarah found herself considering the possibility in a way she might not have 3 months earlier. The old Sarah, the one who had hidden behind oversized jackets and modified exercises, might have dismissed such an opportunity as beyond her capabilities. But the experience of revealing her truth and being accepted had shifted her sense of what was possible. "Besides," Jake continued, "you've already been helping other students informally. I've seen how Ashley talks to you about modifying her workouts since she started having knee problems. And Marcus mentioned that you helped him understand how to support his younger brother, who has cerebral palsy." Sarah hadn't realized that her conversations with classmates had been noticed, much less valued. Since her revelation in the gymnasium, several students had approached her with questions about accommodation, adaptation, and the challenge of living with physical limitations. She had found these conversations surprisingly fulfilling, offering perspectives born from her own experience while learning from the diverse challenges her classmates faced. Dr. Peterson actually suggested your name for the position, Jake added. He said you had insights into adaptive fitness that could benefit the entire program. They had reached the psychology building, and Sarah paused at the entrance, still processing the unexpected opportunity. The idea of working formally in adaptive fitness appealed to her in ways she was just beginning to understand. For years, she had seen her physical differences as obstacles to overcome or accommodate. But, lately, she had begun to recognize them as sources of knowledge and insight that could benefit others facing similar challenges. I'll think about it, Sarah said finally. It's not what I had planned for next year, but maybe that's not necessarily a bad thing. Jake smiled, the expression carrying none of his old casual confidence, but instead showing genuine warmth and respect. That's all I can ask. Just consider that you might have more to offer than you realize. As Sarah entered the building and made her way toward Professor Williams's classroom, she reflected on how completely her life had changed since that afternoon when she had finally revealed her truth. The revelation had been terrifying, but it had also been liberating in ways she couldn't have anticipated. Professor Williams was arranging papers on her desk when Sarah entered the classroom, and she looked up with the warm smile that had made her psychology classes a refuge for Sarah throughout the semester. Sarah, perfect timing. I wanted to talk to you about your final research project before the other students arrive. Sarah took a seat in the front row, a position she never would have chosen at the beginning of the semester, but now occupied naturally. The back corner that had once seemed like protection now felt like isolation, and Sarah had discovered that she preferred engagement to invisibility. Your research on adaptive resilience was exceptional, Professor Williams continued. But, more than that, your analysis of the difference between temporary limitations and permanent accommodations provided insights that I think could be valuable to a much wider audience. Thank you, Sarah replied, still adjusting to praise that focused on her intellectual contributions rather than her ability to overcome her physical challenges. I've been contacted by the Journal of Adaptive Psychology about a special issue they're planning on resilience and accommodation. They're looking for diverse perspectives, including voices from people who have lived experience with the topics they're studying. Professor Williams paused, studying Sarah's face carefully. I think your work could make a significant contribution to that discussion. Would you be interested in developing your research into a more formal academic article? Sarah felt a familiar flutter of excitement mixed with self-doubt. The opportunity to contribute to academic discourse about topics that had shaped her entire life felt both thrilling and intimidating. I'd be honored, Sarah said, but I'm not sure I have the experience with academic publishing that something like that would require. Professor Williams smiled. That's exactly why they want diverse voices. Academic psychology has too often studied resilience and adaptation from the outside, without input from people who have actually navigated these challenges. Your perspective could help bridge that gap. As other students began filtering into the classroom, Sarah found herself contemplating two unexpected opportunities that had emerged from her decision to reveal her truth. The adaptive fitness position that Jake had suggested and the academic publishing opportunity that Professor Williams had offered both represented possibilities she never would have considered when she was focused primarily on hiding her differences. The class session focused on reviewing key concepts from the semester, with particular attention to theories of human adaptability and resilience. As Professor Williams led discussions about the various ways people respond to challenges and limitations, Sarah found herself contributing to conversations with a confidence that would have been unimaginable at the beginning of the term. Sarah, you mentioned earlier that resilience isn't always about returning to a previous state, Professor Williams said during one particularly engaging discussion. Can you elaborate on what you mean by that? I think sometimes we assume that resilience means getting back to exactly where you were before a challenge or setback, Sarah replied, aware that the entire class was listening attentively. But sometimes resilience means accepting that you can't go back, and instead finding new ways to move forward. Jake, who had enrolled in the psychology class after his experience in the gymnasium, nodded thoughtfully. Like how an athlete who suffers a permanent injury might become a coach or trainer instead of trying to return to playing? Exactly, Sarah said. Or how someone who loses a physical capability might develop other strengths that they never would have discovered otherwise. It's not about returning to normal. It's about creating a new normal. Professor Williams beamed with the satisfaction of an educator who had watched a student find their voice over the course of a semester. That's a profound insight, and it highlights something important about how we define success and recovery. As the class period drew to a close, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. 6 months earlier, she had been the quiet girl in the back corner, defined primarily by what she couldn't do and focused on minimizing attention to her differences. Now she was actively contributing to academic discussions, considering career opportunities that built on her experiences, and serving as a resource for other students facing their own challenges. After class, as students gathered their belongings and prepared to leave for winter break, Jake approached Sarah one more time. "I wanted to thank you," he said, his tone serious. "Not just for considering the adaptive fitness position, but for teaching me something I didn't know I needed to learn." "What's that?" Sarah asked. "That strength comes in a lot of different forms, and some of the strongest people are the ones who never get recognized for it because their battles aren't visible." Sarah smiled, feeling the truth of Jake's observation resonate with her own experience. "I think we all have invisible battles. Mine just happened to have some visible components." As they left the classroom together, Sarah caught sight of her reflection in the hallway windows. The girl looking back at her bore little resemblance to the hidden, careful student who had started the semester wrapped in an oversized navy jacket. This Sarah stood straighter, made eye contact, and moved through the world with the confidence that comes from being known and accepted for who you actually are. The prosthetic arm that had once been her most carefully guarded secret was now simply part of who she was, visible, acknowledged, and integrated into an identity that was stronger for including rather than hiding her differences. Professor Williams caught up with them as they reached the exit. "Sarah, I hope you'll seriously consider the publishing opportunity. Your voice matters in these discussions." As Sarah walked across campus toward her car, flanked by Jake and Professor Williams, she marveled at how completely her world had transformed. The revelation that she had feared would diminish her had instead opened doors she never knew existed and connected her with people who valued her exactly as she was. The winter air was crisp and cold, but Sarah felt warmed by the knowledge that she no longer had to carry her truth as a burden. Instead, it had become a bridge, connecting her to opportunities, relationships, and a sense of purpose that felt more authentic than anything she had experienced before. The gym where her transformation had begun was visible across the quad, its windows glowing with warm light as evening classes got underway. Sarah could see students inside, working toward their own goals and navigating their own challenges, and she felt a deep sense of gratitude for the moment of courage that had changed everything. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Ashley. "Saw the posting for the adaptive fitness coordinator position. You'd be perfect for it. Hope you apply." Similar messages had been arriving throughout the day from classmates who had witnessed her revelation and supported her growth. The girl who had once felt isolated by her differences now found herself surrounded by a community that had formed around the shared understanding that everyone carries challenges, and everyone deserves support in facing them. As Sarah drove home through the early winter evening, she thought about the essay she would write for Professor Williams about resilience and adaptation. But instead of focusing on her own journey, she found herself wanting to write about the resilience of communities that learn to see and support each other's differences. The story that had begun with mockery and misunderstanding had transformed into something none of them could have predicted, a lesson in the power of truth, the importance of empathy, and the possibility that our greatest vulnerabilities can become our most valuable gifts to the world around us. Sarah Martinez was no longer the girl hiding in the back corner of the classroom. She was the young woman stepping confidently into a future where her differences weren't obstacles to overcome, but strengths to celebrate and share with others who were finding their own paths toward resilience, acceptance, and authentic success.